2, 3, 4.
Well, hello everybody, this is Pastor Brad, and you have joined us for our Wednesday evening Bible study. I am so glad you're here. As always, if you're joining us online tonight, I'd love just to hear from you in the comments. Just give me a shout out. Let me know that you are there. Hey, real quick, before we get started this evening, let me remind you that we are coming back to on-campus services this Sunday, January the 31st. But please do not come until you have gone to pvfbc.com/backtogether. It should be on the screen below me there. pvfbc.com/backtogether, or you can just go to pvfbc.com and a little thing will pop up asking you if you want to go to our Back Together page. It's so important that you go there because there's a lot of things that we're having to do to be able to come back together safely in the midst of the pandemic and the COVID situation in our county and the counties around us. So please do that if you don't mind. And for those of you that are hanging back, we just want you to know we love you. We are with you. And we look forward to seeing you when you are able or feel like it's safe for you to come back and be a part. So don't forget though, go to pvfbc.com/backtogether for all the information you're going to need. Things like masks are required at both the 9 and 10:30 a.m. service. Social distancing will still be in place. Things like that you need to know about. Well, we are continuing on in our study, The Unseen Realm, and we have been in part 2 for a while now called The Household of God. We just finished up chapter 5, and tonight we look at chapter 6, which is called Gardens and Mountains. So I want to pray, and we're just going to step into the study together this evening. Father, thank you so much that we're able to come back together this Sunday. I just pray, oh Lord, that all of our efforts to honor you by being able to worship in person and keep people safe would just all weave together and just be something that is just a blessing for us and for you at the same time. And Lord, I just pray tonight for this study. These are some deep things that we are looking at. We're talking about you, Father, and your heavenly kingdom, as well as your earthly kingdoms and realms and such. And Lord, I pray that this wouldn't just be information for us, but it would help bring transformation as we get a clearer picture of who you are, how big you are, how unfathomable you are, but yet how you've chosen to work on this earth and how you have blessed us so and made us a part of all of your plans. Help me to speak with clarity and wisdom tonight, Father. Ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, well, chapter 5, hopefully if you were joining us, you know this, was about as in heaven, so on earth. Now, Heiser ended the chapter connecting that idea with Eden. Eden. And so sometimes it may be hard to understand what I'm saying, but Eden, E-D-E-N, you know about Eden. He connects that whole idea with Eden. Originally, heaven and earth were one in a sense back in Eden in the beginning. Heavenly realm beings, known as the sons of God, and earthly realm beings, known as humans, were meant to serve him in their respective realms with a great degree of overlap. And remember, I've showed you this, how in the beginning, the heavenly realm, earthly realm, and there was overlap, and they were intended to kind of be together in a sense. Now, this is where we are headed with the coming new heavens and earth, where once again, things above and things below come together. I'm going to talk about this more a bit at the end of our study tonight, but that's where we're headed with the new heavens and the new earth. Always keep that in mind. They are inextricably connected. Well, all this becomes even clearer, Heiser says, once we understand the ancient conception of Eden. Now, let's think about the modern conception of Eden as us, Western Christians in the 21st century, having grown up studying the Bible and such. We all know about Eden. In fact, probably most non-Christians in our culture know about Eden and what it is generally. So what do we think about when we think about Eden? What do we picture Eden as? Well, our first go-to thing obviously is what? Why don't you write it in the comments while I get ready to write it up here. I always love that interaction. Eden is a garden. Yeah, Eden is a garden. And that's how we see it. And Eden is a garden for sure. But it's even more than that. And kind of as a little bit of a side here and a tiny little rabbit trail, another thing that we think about Eden when we think about how it was in the beginning as a garden, we basically think of the whole earth as being Eden. So when it talks about the Garden of Eden, it's talking about generally a garden for sure, but that just was the way the whole earth was. It was a perfect place like the Garden of Eden. And unfortunately, that's not what the Bible teaches. Because if that's the case, if the whole earth is basically Eden, this perfect place that's like a garden, then why did God tell Adam and Eve to leave the garden and subdue it? Genesis 1:28, and God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of heaven and every living thing that moves on the earth. By the way, that's not our license to treat this earth and the creatures on it any way we want. It's just the opposite. We were supposed to manage it lovingly and care for it as God's stewards over it. Little aside there as well. But go back. Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. If the whole earth was perfect at that time, in the same way, then what was the need to subdue? Well, the whole earth was perfect at that time, but not perfect like the Garden of Eden, a particular place on the earth. Something to think about. You can ask me questions about that if you like. We may cover that some more as we go along the study. But here's how Heiser begins the chapter. He says, we've learned that the Old Testament describes two household families of God. One human, and the other non-human. Those two families were created as God's representatives to serve Him in different realms. In this chapter, we'll explore how descriptions of Eden reinforce those concepts. He says we usually think of Eden as it's described in Genesis 2:8, the place for the first humans called home. Yahweh God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there He put the man whom He had formed. But the description of Eden as the home of humankind deflects our attention away from Eden's primary status. Listen carefully to this because we miss this, but it's all there. Heiser says Eden was God's home on the earth. It was His residence. And where the king lives, His council meets. As modern readers, we don't see how that thinking is telegraphed in the biblical text. Ancient readers could not have missed it. So once again, we modern Western Christians don't quite get how accepted and common this way of thinking was, not just to the ancient Israelites, but all of ancient Near Eastern culture. Everybody around back then would have read this description of Eden and have went immediately to the idea that Eden was God's home on this earth, where He would have had a council and governed the affairs of this world. See, ancient Near Eastern culture, their worldview included a foundational idea that the unseen domain of deities was governed by a council. It's almost universal in ancient Near Eastern culture, of which the Israelites were a part. All these cultures saw the gods as governing the affairs of the world from gardens or mountains. And in fact, pretty much every ancient culture and even modern primitive ones see their gods as living in gardens and or on mountains, particularly mountains. Let that sink in for a second. I'll come back to that on another little rabbit trail in just a second. So Heiser writes, ancient people thought of their gods living in luxuriant gardens or mountains for simple reasons. It made sense that the gods would have the best lifestyle because, well, Heiser says, they're gods. Cosmic celebrities can't possibly live like we do. The ancient Near East was primarily an agrarian culture where most people subsisted day to day, hand to mouth. The few who didn't live that way were kings or priests. And thinking as the ancients did, those few had been chosen for that elevated status by the gods. That's why you see often in ancient Near Eastern culture the earthly kings being referred to as the sons of God. They had a special status as being chosen by divinity to rule over the common folk. He says that the environment in ancient Near Eastern culture was hot and arid. Life depended on finding water and harnessing its power. That's why the world's first civilizations were founded along rivers, the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates. Surely the gods lived in a place where water was abundant, where life-sustaining vegetation and fruit grew everywhere, where an abundance of animals were nourished to fatness. The gods lived in places where there was no conceivable lack. It was a paradise. And mountain peaks were the domain of gods because no humans lived there. Now again, it's hard for us in our modern day to get that, but ancient times were not like modern times. People didn't recreationally climb mountains. I mean, that's a hobby today, a super popular hobby. You know, I was reading the other day about climbing Mount Everest and how, I forget the first year it happened, but it hasn't been all that long ago. Was it the 50s, the 40s? I think it was somewhere thereabout. But how since then, now it's just become a traffic jam. And that's why so many people die trying to climb Mount Everest, is because there's so many people lined up, they have to hold back, and they die waiting because of the lack of oxygen and freezing to death and things like that. But you take, thousands of years ago, no one dared do that. That just wasn't something you did, partly because you didn't have the capability to, but partly because it was believed that was the abode of the gods. So ancient times were not like modern times, Heiser says. People didn't recreationally climb mountains, and you're never going to find me doing that either, by the way. I mean, I'm not like terrified of heights like I am of sharks, but I definitely don't care to be up high. The older I get, the worse it gets. He says they had no equipment with which to get very far if they tried. Mountains were remote and forbidding in ancient times, the perfect places for gods to get away from pesky humans. Mountain peaks touched the heavens, which was obviously the domain of the gods. This sort of thinking in part explains why Egypt's temples are carved and painted with the imagery of luscious gardens, or why pyramids and ziggurats, I'll talk more about those in a second, were built. These structures were mountains made by human hands, which served as gateways to the spiritual world, the realm of the gods, in life or in death. They were metaphors in stone. Let that sink in too for just a second. The pyramids, the ziggurats and such, they were symbolized the idea that the gods dwelled in the mountains, and that's why they kind of looked like mountains. And it wasn't just the ancient Near Eastern cultures that thought this way. Practically all ancient cultures, and again, even modern primitive ones, saw their gods living high on the mountains. Now we come back to this idea. So let me flip over here. So he mentioned a ziggurat. Now he mentioned a ziggurat first because we come across that in the Bible. In the book of Genesis, all the people gathered together and built this ziggurat, which was a tower, that the Tower of Babel that reached to heaven. Well, we're all but positive that it was a ziggurat because that was how these things were built in ancient times, and it was a stepped pyramid like this, a ziggurat, and you went up to the top where the temple would be, and this symbolized the idea that the gods dwelled on the mountains. So that's a ziggurat. That was a Babylonian. That's an ancient Near Eastern culture. Well, we also have another ancient Near Eastern culture that did practically the exact same thing, and they built, man, my marker is doing really bad. Let me change. Sorry about that. They built something very similar called a pyramid. Same exact idea. Now, this is where it gets interesting. I don't think Heiser talks about this. He may. I can't remember. But this is something this is me and fascinating to me, which is really, really interesting. So now let's move across the ocean and let's talk about another ancient culture like the Incas or the Aztecs. What did they build? Well, they built something very similar to that. It would be a temple, something like a ziggurat, but it would come down, have a temple at the top, and there would just be steps all the way to the top, right? And now, back where I'm from in Alabama, I think way up north, there was a place where ancient Indians dwelled called, you know what it is? Moundville. And guess what ancient Indians built? Same exact thing. Now, isn't it interesting that you have all these ancient cultures that tried to find their way to God by building these temple-like structures that all had to do with mountains. And there's even a connection in many of them to gardens as well. Makes you kind of wonder if maybe in man's ancient past there was a time when all of mankind was together and they remembered all of this, and as they spread out, it was kind of in their collective memory, which fits exactly with what the Bible describes what happened back in the beginning and following. So, you see how looking outside the scriptures, such as ancient Near Eastern culture, gives us things to help us understand the Bible in context and sheds light on things? Well, let's go back to the book. Heiser discusses how in 1928 a site was discovered in the ancient Near East archaeologists called Ugarit. Ugarit, and let me spell that because some of you may not have the book, but Ugarit. U-G-A-R-I-T. Ugarit, and I think I'm pronouncing that right. It was discovered in 1928. They found hundreds of clay tablets inscribed with a language so closely related to ancient Hebrew that in some cases the grammar and the vocabulary were identical. Their chief deity was El. I got to get a better marker. Hang on. Let's try this one. El. That's a name used for God sometimes in the Old Testament. El had a council of deities under him called sons of El. And he also had a co-ruler named Baal. Baal. Now, if Baal, B-A-A-L, rings a bell, B-E-L-L, it's because the Israelites, you find in the scriptures in the Old Testament, often sinning against God by worshiping Baal. And just so you know, practically every ancient Near Eastern culture worshipped Baal in some form or fashion. Okay, now that's some pretty interesting stuff, and your brain is probably already firing off, and you're probably beginning to think things, and you have all these kind of questions. So let me stop for a second, and let me clarify something. And this may be why, for so long in modern Western Christianity, Bible scholars and professors at seminaries and such just stayed away from it, is because it made them nervous, and I understand why. But as we study ancient Near Eastern religions, we will see, like here, many parallels to the faith of the Israelite, as well as many similar stories that the Israelites told in their books, which is our Old Testament, such as, and I think we'll cover this later, the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Flood. Many secular historians, and this non-Christian historians, and archaeologists who don't believe in God or the Bible, see these parallels and they say, well, you see, this just shows you that it's all just myth and legend. The Israelites borrowed their belief system and stories from earlier myths and others from them, but I want to submit to you it's just the opposite. You know, what if the Israelites were the ones whom God revealed himself to, gave the truth to, and all the other stories and myths surrounding the surrounding cultures were borrowed from them, which is the original truth, or at least the truth they were telling which preceded them. Okay, so don't let this shake you or shake your confidence in the Bible or shake your confidence in the fact that the Israelites were telling us the truth about all these things when you see these other things in other ancient Near Eastern cultures that are similar. So now to what Heiser says we found in those Ugaritic texts. He says El and Baal were, to say the least, markedly different in behavior from Yahweh of Israel. But the literature of Ugarit proved very illuminating in other respects, especially as to where El, Baal, and the Ugaritic Divine Council lived and held court. At Ugarit, the Divine Council had three levels. The highest authority, El, who did most of his ruling through a co-ruling vizier, Baal. And then the second level was the sons of El, and then the third level was messenger gods. The council of El met on a mountain or a lush garden. These were not different places, rather the same place was described in two different ways. Mountain, lush garden, same place, described two different ways. Let those wheels start turning in your mind. The abode of El had an abundant water supply, as it was situated at the source of two rivers in the midst of the fountains of the double deep. The divine council met in a place called Sapanu. I may pronounce that wrong. The remote heights of the north. Sapanu means north. Council meetings were held in the tents of El, or El's tent shrine, whence divine decrees were issued. At times, Baal's palace was in view with its paved bricks that gave his house the clearness of an ancient precious stone called lapis lazuli. Does any of that sound familiar to us as Christians who study the Old Testament? Does any of that sound familiar at all? Such as the idea in the book of Eden of it being near the rivers that are described there, or you move on forward after God had revealed himself to the Israelites and how God would meet up with them in a tent shrine built by specifics, according to specifics. You know, the Old Testament uses almost exactly the same descriptions for the dwelling place of God and his throne room. And the Bible even reveals a three-tiered divine system as well. You have God. Yahweh God is at the top, the Elohim of all Elohim. Next are the sons of God who serve on his council. And then are the rank and file angels, the messengers, that go about doing his will. And there is even more. Listen carefully as Heiser goes into greater detail. The tabernacle tent structure and the tent of meeting, both of which are mentioned throughout the books of Exodus through Judges, are clear parallels to places where God dwells and hands down his decrees. Yahweh could also be found on mountains, Mount Sinai, Mount Zion. And Psalm 48, 1-2, Jerusalem, the city of God, is said to be located in the heights of the north. Mount Zion is the mountain of assembly, again located in the heights of the north. That's in Isaiah 14:13. At Sinai, Moses and others saw the seated God of Israel, under whose feet was the pavement like sapphire, tile work, and like the very heavens for clearness, a precious stone. Now let me stop now, and I'm not quoting Heiser, and I'm kind of inserting my own thoughts. Here's something you may not realize. You may not realize that Mount Zion is another name for Jerusalem. Let's talk about that for 1 second. Mount Zion is another name for Jerusalem. So, Mount Zion equals Jerusalem. Now, something else you may not realize is that the city of Jerusalem actually sits atop a very great hill, which you could almost call a mountain. And one of the reasons why we know this is how the ancient peoples thought of this, even in the New Testament, if you go to the New Testament, when you see some of the gospel writers talking about somebody going to Jerusalem, they always say that they were going up to Jerusalem, no matter which direction they're coming from. So, you know, like if I am in Alabama and I'm going to go up to Nashville, I wouldn't say if I was in Nashville, I'm going to go up to Alabama because Nashville is north of Alabama. And that was the way people thought in ancient times too. But the reason they always say up when it came to Jerusalem is because they all thought of Jerusalem as being up on this holy hill, this holy mountain. It's Mount Zion. Now, hopefully, some things are clicking in your mind in regards to that. So, that's why in the New Testament you see writers have people go up to Jerusalem regardless of what direction they come from. Jerusalem, the holy city, which housed the temple where God dwelled, was on a mountain, fitting into the ancient Near Eastern thinking of godly abodes. This is me talking, by the way, I'm reading my words. In the same way, many don't realize that Eden, the original earthly dwelling place of God, is also, if you look for it, referred to as being on or a, guess what? Mountain. Back to Heiser. So, he says, the Garden of Eden, of course, is a lush, well-watered habitation. Ezekiel 28:13 mentions the Garden of Eden, the Garden of God, but then adds the description that the Garden of God is God's holy, guess what? Mountain. Ezekiel 28:14. We'll look at that in a second. And we naturally think of God's mountain as Mount Sinai or Mount Zion. When it comes to garden imagery, the latter is spoken of in Edenic terms. Like Eden, Mount Zion is also described as a watery habitation. Whether Sinai or Zion, the mountain of God is, in effect, his temple. You see how all these things are converging together and giving us a clearer picture of things in God's Word? So let's look at that Ezekiel text that he's talking about. Ezekiel chapter 28, verse 11. Moreover, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Ezekiel, and this was the word: Son of man, raise a lamentation over, and this is a real human being, person, king of Tyre, and say to him, Thus says the Lord God. Now, before I give you the prophecy, you have to understand that God is giving Ezekiel a prophecy that has kind of a double meaning. It's almost a euphemism. It applies to a human being living at the time, but it kind of echoes back to something that happened in the beginning, and see if you can pick up on that. He says, You were the signet of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering: sardius, topaz, and diamond, beryl, onyx, and sapphire, emerald, and carbuncle. And crafted in gold were your settings and your engravings. On the day that you were created, they were prepared. You were an anointed guardian cherub. I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire you walked. Now, we'll come back to that later and talk more about what that means. But at the very least, you see there the connection and the idea that Eden wasn't just a place in a valley where there was a garden, but it was actually a mountain dwelling place of God. Now, Heiser closes this chapter with the implications of all of this. And I know this is a lot to take in. He says, An ancient Israelite would have thought of Eden as the dwelling place of God and the place from which God and his council direct the affairs of humanity. The imagery is completely consistent with how Israel's neighbors thought about their gods. But in biblical theology, there is additional messaging. Listen up. As we'll see in the ensuing chapters, the biblical version of the divine council at the divine abode includes, wait for it, a human presence. The theological message is that the God of Israel created this place not just as his own domain, but because he desires to live among his people. Yahweh desires a kingdom rule on this new earth that he has created, and that rule will be shared with humanity. Since the heavenly council is also where Yahweh is, both family households should function together. Had the fall not occurred, humanity would have been glorified and made part of that council also. Heaven and earth, the two realms coming together on the mountain of God, which is Eden, and we were intended to be a part of that. Hopefully the fireworks are going off in your minds and hearts right now. This is not speculation, Heiser writes. In the last chapter, we saw the beginning of the theological idea that humans are the children of God. It was God's original intent to make them part of his family. The failure in Eden would alienate God from man, but God would make a way of salvation to bring believers back into that family. We also saw that humanity's presence showed that God's original desire was for his human children to participate in his rule. Both of these theological threads wind through the Old Testament and create the context from which the New Testament writers will talk about the kingdom and the glorification of us believers. These are ideas, he says, we'll return to in later chapters. One more verse about Eden, the one that will vault us into the next chapter. Eden, and we'll look at it next time, Eden is described in Ezekiel 28:2 as the seat of the gods. The phrase should be familiar to modern readers. It speaks of governing authority, county seat, congressional seat. Ezekiel's words draw attention to Eden as a seat of authority and action. There was work to be done. God had plans for the whole planet, not just Eden. Now, the implications here extend even further, and Heiser will talk about them later, I'm sure. This gives us insight into the way things would have been had there not been a fall. But it also gives us a glimpse into the way things will be one day. You see, as it was in the beginning, so it will be in the end when Jesus returns to set all things to rights. You see, we missed the part about how in the new heaven and earth, when Jesus returns and set up his kingdom on this literal new heaven and earth, we missed the part about how the Bible refers to us and speaks in regards to us that we will reign with Jesus, whose kingdom seat is New Jerusalem. And the holy city will come down out of God. You remember how big it was? It's like a mountain that comes down, and that is where God dwells. Now, if you go back to the beginning and you see the connection of how we were supposed to be a part of that, Well, it makes sense. That's the way it's going to be in the end. And sure enough, 2 Timothy 2:11 and 12, you see where Paul writes to Timothy, the saying is trustworthy, for if we have died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. Now that is humbling. Not only in the new heaven and earth, when I will have my resurrection body that's able to live eternally there, not only am I going to get to live there, but as God's people, God's going to reinstate that whole idea of us ruling and reigning with him in his family. That's incredible. As it was, so it will be. You see the connections and how these things that just seem to be ancient Near Eastern culture, parallels and things, give us insight into the scriptures that help us understand theology and biblical doctrines even better. Well, I hope I didn't muddy any waters or confuse anybody. If I did, will you please send me a question at pastor@pvfbc.com, or you can text it to me. My information's below. But I had someone else send in some questions, and so it's time to answer a question sent in from Crystal. And here is her question. It's kind of a couple of questions, and some more of her questions I'll address later, but here's a couple kind of grouped together. So she asked the questions, where do the sons of God originate? Are they truly his offspring? I seem to remember during your Endgame series you mentioning the comparison to Greek mythology figures. There's a Bible verse talking about the men of lore. Are these Greek mythology figures? So where did the sons of God originate? Well, if you remember, we looked at that on Wednesday nights. They were created by God in the beginning before he created the earth and humans. So he created his heavenly realm of beings, these Elohim, before he created the earthly realm beings. They were angelic-like beings of a higher order meant to serve on a divine council. They weren't just angels. They were a higher order of angels, if you will, meant to serve on a divine council that he will later divide all the nations between, which we'll look at later on. And if you remember in the book of Job, God schools Job near the end asking him this, Job 38:4-7, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? Listen carefully, verse 7. I mean, let that get by. Verse 7, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. That's a direct reference to these members of the divine council. So they were around before us. God created them. So they are his offspring in the sense that he created them. Just like Adam was a son of God in the sense that he created him. But nothing biological or anything like that is implied. And yes, there are some parallels with the sons of God and the Greek gods, which would make sense if the Greek god myths could be traced back to these original angelic beings who were supposed to serve on God's council, but rebelled against him and went about masquerading as real gods to deceive the people. There's evidence in the scripture that those gods of the Greeks and others were the same gods, recycling themselves in different names and different ways among different people groups and different nations to deceive them and lead them away from God. And so those angelic beings, higher order beings, sons of God, would be the basic source of the Greek god myths. And if you study Greek mythology, there are some surprising parallels between what you see there and some of the things we find in Scripture. Now, the sons of God are related to the men of lore, but they are not the men of lore. Genesis 6, verse 1, when man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God. Now, we've learned that refers to that higher order angelic being that served on the council. The sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. It's a great transgression and rebellion of these higher order heavenly beings. And then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, his days shall be 120 years. And then verse 4, there's a connection between the sons of God, these angelic beings, somehow cohabitating with human women, and the product of that was this, verse 4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of lore or the men of renown. So the men of lore were the biological, literal offspring of when the sons of God somehow were able to mate with the daughters of men. These kind of hybrid demigod type beings were the men of lore. So there is a connection there. Hope that helped a little bit, but I know so many times when you answer a question about stuff like this, it just raises up more. Send those to me. If you have them, I'll do my best to address them. Well, I'm going to be honest with you, I am just plumb wore out tonight. So we're going to stop here. Hey, just so you know, next Wednesday night we will not have an online study, and here's why. So next Wednesday night, on campus Wednesday night services return, as well as Kids View and Student Ministry here on campus, mask required. So if you're able to come and be a part of this study in person, come on. We will tape that, edit it, and then show it the following Wednesday. So from there on out, the Wednesday study will be a week off. It allows us to do that and get everything ready to go and edit it, so we have to take a week off for that. So next week there won't be a study, but the next week we will, but it will be a week behind. God bless you all. I love you. Good night.